Today we sit in on a press conference with Dr. Ravi Zacharias.
There is justice. The balances will be set straight. Number two, there is a relationship with Him that defines all other relationships, that gives you hope beyond the grave, not just for a pragmatic purpose on this world.
Claim your heritage of truth.
Yesterday, Dr. Zacharias got the Lifetime Achievement Award from CBA, so we're very grateful and honored for that. And we're going to have him share now. Thank you. And then we'll take questions. He's going to share for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up for any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ruth, and it's a real honor to be here. I appreciate you coming. Over the years, it's been a privilege to come to what used to be CBA and now ICRS, so the years tell you how culture is changing, how means are changing, how avenues of communication are changing. And with that in mind, Ruth, do you have a copy of that? You took that from there. If I can hold it in my hand, since we're talking about the visual, it will be great to have it. Yes, the two books. This one is really a tremendous effort on the part of Kingstone called The Lamb and the Fuhrer. Some of you may be familiar with the series I did with Multnomah years ago. It's called the Great Conversation Series. Don Jacobson, at that time heading up Multnomah, asked me if I would engage in that kind of apologetic. The first one was called The Lotus and the Cross, Jesus Talks to Buddha. The second one was called Sense and Sensuality, Jesus Talks to Oscar Wilde. I think the third one was The Lamb and the Fuhrer, Jesus Talks to Hitler. Then we did New Birth or Rebirth, Jesus Talks to Krishna. Several such in which I use a third person as a foil in a conversation. And I think in this instance, maybe Bonhoeffer or others involved who pitch in the conversation. The ideas are not to put your ideas into the mouth of the other conversationalist, but to take what they have already said and just interject it at the right time in the conversation. So it's not fictional in terms of the ideas, it is just fictional in terms of the structure of the story. The ideas are very much pregnant in the main characters here. It was amazing to be signing books this morning and seeing the number of people who came by and would say something like, my son doesn't like to read except in comic book fashion. And when we say, how old is your son? They'll say 30 or 31. Really? You know, it's fascinating that for some people, the medium is still a preferred category for them. They are not so much interested in the content, they're more interested in the medium through which you're communicating it. So I think the Kingstone is really onto a huge venture here to reach this generation. I'm privileged to have The Lamb and the Fuhrer. It was written so long ago, but I'm looking forward to reading it in this format now. And I hope sincerely that some new ground will be broken, some new minds will be touched, because we really have to meet people at their comfort zone, at their comfort level, and in the quietness of their own private reading, hopefully God will break through into their thinking and bring changes in lives. The other one that is going to be released later this fall is called Why Suffering. It's come on the heels of Why Jesus, which was done by Faith Words. My colleague at Oxford University, Vince Vitale, who's a tutor at Oxford, also at our Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, which offers accredited degrees at Oxford University through Wycliffe Hall. Vince and I have co-authored the Why Suffering book. It's a question that haunts in every open forum. Richard Dawkins brings this up, every skeptic brings this up. Why does an all-powerful, all-loving God allow for such evil and suffering and pain in this world? Who has not asked that question? It's a question you ask whether you're a follower of Christ or not a follower of Christ. So Vince, in his dissertation, dealt with this subject. Vince is fairly young, I don't know if he's late 20s or early 30s. So when he did his work in that dissertation and asked me if I would co-author that, Joey Paul, who has been a friend for many, many years, took on the project, read it, and has twice written to us, and in his own words has said, he believes he has never read anything so comprehensive and so meaningful and relevant as this particular book on that subject. I did 4 or 5 chapters, Vince did 4 or 5. Only time will tell whether it's indeed new material for people to engage in and how to deal with the issue of pain and suffering. I tell my apologists behind every question is a questioner. You always must understand the questioner, or you will never be answering the questioner. You will be just answering an abstract question. If you don't reach the person, then you have not really connected with what it is that's been asked. So these two books here, The Lamb and the Fuhrer, fascinatingly dealing with the mind of a man for whom decimation and devastation was key, and the Superman in this world who was going to destroy every other force that stood in the way. And now the problem of evil and suffering, why suffering through faith words, this one through Kingstone. I'm open to ask here, I think the galley proofs have just arrived in the last few days for why suffering with Vince Vitale and myself, and we will have copies of this for each one of you. My earnest prayer is, I really don't write for the sake of writing. That's not what I do. I'm sure most writers don't do it just for the sake of writing. In this issue, I hope to diffuse the most difficult question that human beings have raised. A little answer like this: there are undeniable realities in life. Which paradigm best answers that? So here it is. The most supreme ethic in the world is love. Where there is love, there has to be a possibility of freedom. Because without freedom, you cannot have love. You can have compliance, but you cannot have love. So the most supreme ethic is love. Where you have love, you must have freedom. Where you have freedom, there's always the possibility of evil and sin. Where there is evil and sin, there is the need for a savior. Where there is a savior, there is a possibility of redemption. So you take the undeniable supreme ethic of love and the necessity of freedom, and on those two links the paradigm is ultimately built. And we try to deal with the answers first, to diffuse it philosophically, then to give the Christian answer. I'm so convinced that only in the Judeo-Christian worldview is there a comprehensive addressing of this issue. For example, if you ask a Muslim, his answer will be, Inshallah. They have no right to even question why evil, why suffering. If you ask a Buddhist, he will say, it's your karma. It's what you're paying. Every birth is a rebirth. The Hindu would say the same thing. Only in the Judeo-Christian worldview is this question really legitimate. Legitimized, I should say, because it is legitimate in every heart. Only in the Judeo-Christian worldview does it get justified. And what the answer is, I think, is very unique, and from a perspective that other worldviews do not address. So I will leave it open for questions now. The Lamb and the Fuhrer, in the comic book fashion, and why suffering.
State your name and who you're with.
Yes.
Jeanne Dennis, Heritage of Truth.
Richard Dawkins says that the cross and Jesus' sacrifice for us is so petty, so unworthy of the universe. What would you say to him about that?
When Richard Dawkins makes value statements, you have to ask him what values is he basing on, because he is the one who at his Voltaire lectures on humanism said he would ultimately actually have to say there's no such thing as evil. He not only debunked good, and because on the basis of his assumptions, he would have to even say there's no such thing as evil. It is fascinating, very recently, when Australia was playing England in a cricket match, and the English batsman cheated while at the crease, and he knew he was out, and the umpire had not seen the ball touch the bat and gave him not out. Stuart Broad, the cricketer, veteran cricketer, ought to have walked and said, I was out, the ball did touch my bat. Once upon a time, that's the way cricket was played. That's why the phrase, it's not cricket, because it was a game that was so fair. Broad did not walk. You should have seen Dawkins's anger and ire over that slight cheating in a cricket match. He was blogging all over the place. The anger, he said, the man is destroying the game of cricket over this. I'm not going to root for England anymore. I'm going to cheer for Australia. And somebody wrote and said, Richard, it's a cricket game. What are you getting so upset about? And Richard is the one who had earlier on said that there's no such thing as good or evil. We are all dancing to our DNA. I said, Richard, Stuart Broad was just dancing to his DNA. Why are you so upset with him? So to talk about the God of this world, dealing with the cross as something petty, for a man who loses his control over a cricket game, is hardly reflective of a man of sober judgment in all of this. The reason he would say that is because he does not understand the gravity of what sin is all about. If you do not understand the gravity of sin, you will never understand the beauty and the splendor and the power of the cross. So one links into the other. With Dawkins, I wouldn't even go that route. I would just open him up within his own assumptions. What is the basis of his value judgments that he actually makes? Is there an objective point of reference for what he makes, or is it purely subjective? And if it's purely subjective, is he making a truth statement or just an emotive statement? That's where you'd open up the conversation.
Sam Beeman with Refresh Media.
Yes, sir.
I was curious, how would you say that we should witness to someone who has gone through pain and suffering, has lost maybe several loved ones or friends, and you're trying to share the gospel with them? At one time they were in church, but they've fallen away. What would you recommend to witness to them?
It's a great question, Dan, and I think there are two tracks to this approach. We must remember that. There is an intellectual, rational side to the question, which is very genuine, but can seem very distant from the pain that is being felt because of the loss, but it is necessary. The other one is the pastoral side of the question, where you're trying to bring comfort and trying to bring healing, trying to bring some kind of restoration. Both of those tracks are important. The pastor who is dealing with the pastoral side cannot often come from the level of the issue of the rational defense of the necessity of evil. That is what we apologists do, although we do a lot of the pastoral side of it too. So let me just distance myself for the moment and say, what is the end position at which we want this person? Then we determine how we get there. The end position is this. Rationally, we have to approach the question removed from the emotional weight of the moment. It is like a doctor who's doing surgery on a patient, but doesn't do it on his own sons and daughters because he's emotionally locked into it. He cannot be as objective as he needs to be in the decision making. If you're emotionally locked into a situation, it's very hard to really distance yourself. But one has to at some point, and so here it is. I will often say to the people, so much evil, so much suffering, so much pain in this world, how can you justify an all-loving, all-powerful God? So I approach it apologetically this way. It's the point to which I need to bring them, however I do it. Number one, when they say there's evil, they assume there is good. When they assume there is good, they assume there's a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. When they assume there's a moral law, they must posit a moral lawgiver. But that's whom they're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is the question they're really asking? Positing evil assumes a moral lawgiver within the paradigm. Very important to know that. Now somebody might say to me, why do you have to have a moral lawgiver? I say for a very simple reason. Because every time the problem of evil and pain is raised, it is either raised by a person or about a person. Which means the questioner assumes intrinsic worth to personhood. The questioner is assuming that there is essential value to personhood. That's an assumption a naturalist cannot make. There is no essential value to personhood in naturalism. We are the random collocation of atoms, time plus matter plus chance. So when they raise the question, they're actually violating their own first principle. They are assuming the human being has value. But in naturalism, there is no essential value. It is contrived or given value by either state or fiat or some kind of decision. If the human being has essential value, the only way that human being can have essential value is if he or she is the creation of an essentially worthy creator in whom dwells essential worth, and that is God himself. So to truly legitimize the question, God needs to be in the paradigm. You cannot remove God. So that's the first thing, to defuse the question. You cannot say, I'm doing away with God, because then you're saying I have a legitimate question that's actually not very legitimate, because I've removed the very notion of essence in human life. How we get there is key in conversation. But the second one is the pastoral one. Look at it this way. For example, in The Lamb and the Fuhrer, Suppose there is no God, and Hitler takes his own life and he's gone. Where is justice in all of this? When millions and millions are obliterated and a person just puts the gun to his or her head and they're gone, there is no sense of justice that will ever be visible to you and me in the light of those who have been the perpetrators of justice. You have to do away with justice if you do away with God, because there is no justice in the end. Virtue and distress and vice and triumph may end up making atheists of mankind. But there's a second thing. If there is no life beyond the grave, what happens to all relationships? All relationships are finally severed at the moment that one individual breathes his or her last. No justice, no future in relationship. What do you do to find hope and succor and sustenance through it? You have to pull yourself up by your own metaphysical bootstraps and just keep going. In God, all of these three issues are answered. There is justice. The balances will be set straight. Number two, there is a relationship with Him that defines all other relationships, that gives you hope beyond the grave, not just for a pragmatic purpose on this world. And finally, I would say, He is the one who enters into you and sustains you and strengthens you through suffering. Like Annie Johnston Flint, the great hymn writer, who suffered with such pain and wrote that beautiful hymn, He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater, He giveth more strength when the labors increase. I truly believe the undeniable realities of justice, hope, and sustenance are best defended in the Judeo-Christian worldview. Without that worldview, these three are gone. There is really no hope for tomorrow, there is no justice for tomorrow, and there is no sustenance and strength. You almost callously have to move on, like Bertrand Russell said, only in the philosophy of unyielding despair have I found meaning in this life. Unyielding despair. So what's the bottom line? The worldview you and I hold to has to have explanatory power. It has to have explanatory power. There has to be a way of explaining the existential and the rational realities with which we live. I think only in the Christian world, Judeo-Christian worldview, do you have explanatory power. In the materialistic worldview, you cannot even legitimize the question. So the goal will be to bring them to that point, the pastoral sustenance and succor and love. What did Job say? I had heard of you by the hearing of my ear. I have now seen you. I abhor myself and I'm horrified. In the experience of God comes that ultimate answer for which propositional answers alone are not enough. It's that relationship with God that transcends your situation and removes it beyond words to the reality of a relationship.
Thank you.
I'm Mary Jane Holt, and starting in July, I'll be hosting Reach to Touch. For a written column, I've interviewed people since 1986. This is going to be different, and I need you to tell me how to handle it when I ask about a story of healing. And in today's world, there's so many new answers. Alternative medicine offers much. Technology offers much. And occasionally you come across a story of true healing, and you want to tell it, you want to share it, to give hope. But I totally am turned off, and I walk away when the first thing out of their mouth is, God never meant for my body to be sick, so I did this and this, and He healed me. Well, my background's in nursing, and I know about all those who didn't heal. I want to hear their story. I want to publicize it. Help me.
Those who have walked through with pain without the privilege or the blessing of being healed want to tell their story? Is that
Those who have been healed
okay?
want to tell their story, and they frequently preface it by saying, God never meant for my body to be sick,
I
so
see.
this is how He healed me. I don't want any part of that. And yet I know that they have a history there that could perhaps help a listener. And I need to get past.
Yeah, I think the story I would break into two lines, actually. I think the assumption that God never intended for me to be sick or never intended for this to be part of my life is actually a violation of what theologically is clearly to the contrary. In this world you will have much suffering, says the scriptures, but he has overcome the world. Ultimately, Lazarus did have to die. He may have been raised to show for the glory of God for that moment, but sickness does come. Sickness does take over. I come from the Christian and Missionary Alliance, where the founder of which was A.B. Simpson, Savior, Christ as Savior, Sanctifier, Healer, and Coming King. But A.B. Simpson himself, in his latter years, suffered with much sickness and much debilitation. The reality is there. Those who deny it are building a theology that is unbiblical. The process of the people in the scriptures that you see who had ailments, who had sickness, and Christ himself suffering in pain. I thirst. My God, why have you forsaken me? He is speaking out of the agony or the physical moment of what is going on. And for this very purpose came he into the world. He carries our sicknesses, he bears our sorrows. I myself, remarkably, have experienced something that I don't often talk about. Many of you may not be aware that I lived with unbelievable pain for 27 years with 2 titanium rods in my back that are still there, 4 clamps, 8 screws that bolted me down from a triple herniation in 2002. I don't believe there was a day I got up from 1985 till 2 years ago where I did not live with some form of pain. I never went for medication because I didn't want to mess with my mind. The maximum I would do is an anti-inflammatory for a few days, but never took any of the narcotic stuff. I just didn't want to mess with that. It was 2 years ago, in an absolutely remarkable way, I was having breakfast with a friend from China, and I don't know if I have the time to go into the length of that story, but he said he woke up one morning. Now, I'm a Christian apologist. I work with rational stuff. So he comes to me from Singapore, and he says he woke up 2 days before here in Atlanta, and he said, lying in bed, God tells me 2 things that he wants me to tell you. The moment somebody tells me that, I begin to say, oh my word, what's going on here? What kind of a fellow am I with? He was the CEO of Gillette for Asia Pacific, Du Eng Sen. He's on our board in Singapore. He insisted I see him, and I was leaving for 5 weeks, 29th of May, 2 years ago, 2012. So I told my wife, I've got to go and see him just half an hour. So we went, had breakfast near my office here in Atlanta. He said, God told me 2 things that he wanted you to know. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, number 1, God told me that the anointing on your life in the years to come is going to be greater than all of the years before. I said, God really told you that 2 days ago? Yesterday. He said, yeah. I said, if that happens, I'll be very grateful to him. He said, but then he told me he wanted me to tell you something, Ravi, that like the Apostle Paul, you'll always have a thorn in the flesh, but not to lose heart. He's going to take care of it. He said, tell Ravi I'm going to take care of him 3, 4, 5. He said, Lord, I don't know what that means. He said, you tell Ravi, he'll know what it means. So he said, what does it mean? I said, since 1985, the pain in my spine has been L3-4 and L4-5. And so when you tell me 3-4-5, that's the only thing that leaps into my mind, and tears started to run down his face. He leaned over, touched my spine, and prayed for me. My wife is sitting in the audience, so I go back home. I say, honey, I've had a very strange breakfast this morning. I said, don't tell anybody. But this is exactly what happened. And I left on a trip. My travel associate is here, and I pick up our bags. I go back after the next security stop. For the first time in years, I crossed my legs to bend down and tie my shoelace. I hadn't done that from 1985. And he was standing there watching me. I said, what on earth is going on? If I'd done that before, I'm not kidding you. My wife was, when I was preaching for Jim Simula, I just crossed my leg briefly like this. She and a colleague of mine had to usher me onto the plane. I couldn't walk because I'm bolted down. I was that tight, I was just strained. And for 7 weeks, I would have to do an anti-inflammatory. All of a sudden, I couldn't even demonstrate this for you before. And since May 29, 2012, I have had no pain in my back. How did God do it? Had I prayed before? Yes, of course. I've been at altars. I'd had all kinds of things done and so on. When you're in miserable pain, my wife would say, why do you go to such people? I'd go to the strangest people. They'd even tell you, they'd look into your eyes and tell you what's wrong with you. That kind of stuff. When you're in pain, you do that. I didn't mess with medicine, but I messed with all kinds of theories. Wondering this, wondering that. God touched me and healed me. A long way to tell you, for 27 years I lived with pain. God has touched me in His time and in His will. I will never ever say He did not intend for me to live with this debilitation. I live still with a limp in the sense that my back will never be at full strength. I can't play tennis, which I sorely miss. Can't play any sports, which I sorely miss. But I sure cover the globe 240 days a year last year. My colleague, both of them, one after another, 6'5" each, they would tell you I wore them out. And I keep writing and moving along. Write the story, but don't write wrong theology. Don't encourage people to think in the wrong direction. There is pain, there is suffering.
Last question, I think. Thank you.
Ravi, my name is Joe Taylor, and this is my wife Karen from On Faith's Edge Radio. We interview Christian business people and entertainers and authors about their faith. Just in a public setting here, I want to say thank you. I came to faith primarily through the teachings of you and William Lane Craig, and through a very logical process. All the emotion came later.
And it must, yeah.
What would you say, can you just speak to the historical accuracy of Jesus Christ and the dependability of the Bible as a historical document?
Great question. By the way, Bill Craig and I were classmates at Trinity.
Wow.
We used to have fellowship around the garbage can every night. I just go on talk, and Bill went on to study in Europe and so on. So he's also living in Atlanta now. The longest journey in life, said Donald Cogan, Archbishop Donald Cogan of years gone by, is from the head to the heart. If apologetics remains sparked in the cerebral section of your life, it will only become an argumentative thing for you. If it never gets to the heart and the devotional side of one's life, then apologetics has failed and has become an icon and an end in itself. One has to connect from the head to the heart, so the emotions ultimately, sooner or later, have to be reached. In terms of the historicity of the scriptures, I appreciate you asking the question, because the fact of the matter is that I think this is going to be the battleground. I mean, with Bart Ehrman and all of them trying to take it apart, they'll take one verse out here and one verse out there, do total injustice to the total corpus of scriptural material. 40 authors, 66 books, 1,500 plus years. No piece of literature exists where the core of the message has remained unchanged. And so what one does when you debate it, there are different ways of debating it. Just because I've celebrated 30 years in the ministry, I was given a Codex Sinaiticus as a gift last week when I was in Oxford University. And when you look at that codex from 1700 years ago, fascinating to see how beautifully the text is preserved in the Gospels, in the Old Testament. I remember being in Albania, the most atheistic country in the world, and after finishing speaking to the parliament, the curator of the museum asked if he could see me privately and take me to the museum. I didn't know what he was up to, but it's a long story. I went over there, and all of a sudden come these armed guards with 4 books in their hands, holding it like this. And Enver Hoxha, the dictator, had actually tried to lay his hands on these and burn them, but people hid them in a way where he could never get a hold of them. This comes from the 400s. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written by hand in the pen of Chrysostom with a perfectly justified column. In the 5th century, you've got the 4 Gospels in gold ink, in perfectly justified columns, done by Chrysostom. It was found after an excavation in a church that had been built around 900, of all places, in Albania, where they discovered this, and now it's in the museum. They now think they have found a fragment of Luke's gospel in Oxford. It's a tiny little one, but you can actually go there and see a fragment of it. If you go to the University of Michigan, there's thousands of pieces, thousands. This generation will not have the time to even put it together, leave alone translate it. You go back across the centuries and you look at Philippians 2, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon himself the form of a servant. Being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore God also has exalted him and given to him a name that is above every name. That is the earliest Christian hymn. Oh, it goes back to possibly the very first century. The entire gospel is present in just that one passage, the hymns, in which that's where they were to sing to each other in songs and hymns and spiritual songs, because it was the bearer of the gospel story to them. You know, you take the passage of the woman taken in adultery and you start making an issue saying, you know, this is not there in the original writings. Yeah, the translators of the scriptures knew that. And you go back across many, many years and you'll see, I think it's Mark 8 or something like that, it says at the bottom, you know, this particular narrative was not found in many of the earliest manuscripts. Only the Christian scholars have been honest enough to know what it is that was suspect and not there. You will never see that kind of a notation in the Quran. The Christians never felt threatened by a scrutinizing of the text. No matter what verse they take, was Josiah 8 years old or 18 years old and all, for goodness sakes, you know, after 3,500 years of writing, when they will quote Socrates and Plato, from whom we do not even have one statement directly. And they will quote Socrates and Plato with Aristotle. It is a duplicitous stance and state of mind. Most scholars, even liberal now, have come to the conclusion anybody who says this Jesus of history never really existed is really talking out of the back of the hat out there. The historical dependability of, you take somebody like Marcus Bockmull teaching at Oxford right now, under whom my colleague Nabil Qureshi is going to study. They will take the gospel narratives, even if they have issues with form criticism and all of that. They take the story of Jesus as an historical value. Anyone who says there's no historicity to this is only doing this because that's what they want to believe. The historicity of Christ is so clearly demonstrated in the four Gospels, and then you move on to the epistles. Within 300 years of the existence, no history in antiquity has that degree of documentary corroboration as the New Testament does. What happened to the Quran? In the third caliphate of Uthman, when they saw variant readings, they burned everything that contradicted what they wanted to. And now studies are going on which are going to expose a lot of this. Christians didn't play that game. We are very confident with the codices that we have, the tens of thousands of fragments that we have, the parchments that we have. Who would have ever thought that you could walk into the shrine of the book and see 3 complete copies of Isaiah going back 2,800 years or whatever? The scriptures cannot be broken, and the historicity of it is splendid and clearly demonstrated in our time. The gospel story has its core to believe in your heart and confess with your mouth that Jesus Christ the Lord and that died and was raised again from the dead. That gospel story remains unaffected from the 2,500 years of notation. So that's it. Thank you very much. Please feel free to. Thank you for giving me your time. Several had asked for private interviews and so on, and so Ruth said if we did this one for all and all for one, we might have it a little more peaceful for everybody concerned. Enjoy these 2 books, and thanks for the work you all do, by the way. Keep it up. I'm grateful to you. Thank you.